and welcome to the National Museum of the Pacific Wars webcast. I'm your host, Lauren Cornegay-Dollar, and I am also the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the museum. I am so excited about today's presentation and hope you are as well. For today's webcast, we will be hearing from Robert Kim. He is a lawyer and author and recently published Victory in Shanghai, which details the story of Lieutenant James Kim, who was in the 40th Infantry Division of the National Guard in the Pacific. Welcome to the program, Robert.
Thank you, Lauren. It really is an honor to be here to speak with your audience about a subject that involved upwards of 150,000 men in the War in the Pacific, yet seems to have almost completely escaped from historical memory. That is the experience of the National Guard in the Pacific Theater. The ground war in the Pacific has become really the story of the Marine Corps in popular memory, and with good reason. The Battle of Iwo Jima and so many other of the most remembered battles of the land war in the Pacific were dominated by the Marine Corps. And the Army ends up getting very little attention, and the National Guard even less. Yet, what we find is that when you take a closer look, the Marine Corps actually accounted for only a minority of the U.S. ground forces in the Pacific. Out of the 28 divisions that the United States sent to fight in the Pacific, the Marine Corps only accounted for 6. 22 of them were infantry divisions of the U.S. Army. And of those, almost half were from the National Guard, 10 of the Army's 22 divisions. In fact, not only did the National Guard play a very large role in the war in the Pacific, but furthermore, the war in the Pacific theater was very much the predominant campaign for the Guard. In comparison, in the European and Mediterranean theaters, which involved several times the number of Army divisions, there were only 9 National Guard divisions. So the war in the Pacific is very much should be at the center of the conversation in looking at the contribution of the National Guard in the Second World War. And the 40th Infantry Division was, I think, a fairly good representative of the Guard as a whole. It was primarily a California National Guard division. It was composed of infantry units and artillery units from California, and also artillery units from Utah and support units from Nevada. And it began its federal service in March 1941, called up for active duty, like other divisions of the National Guard, as war with Japan loomed on the horizon. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, it ended up serving in the defense of the California coastline. And in the process of guarding the coast, was reorganized. It then took on the triangular configuration of U.S. Army divisions during the Second World War and became even more multi-state in its setup. It had 2 units from California, the 160th and 185th Infantry, and the 108th Infantry from New York, making it a unit encompassing major combat units from both coasts. After several months of guarding the California coast, this division was sent to Fort Lewis, Washington, to train for overseas deployment. The division ended up deploying to Hawaii in August 1942 to guard the islands against the ongoing threat of a Japanese invasion or seaborne attack, until the summer of 1943, when it finally was withdrawn from coastal defense to train for amphibious operations and jungle warfare, with the anticipation that it would be sent to combat in the South Pacific. In December 1943, the division finally boarded troop transports and moved to the U.S. base complex at the island of Guadalcanal, which had been seized from the Japanese 2 years ago. The division finally conducted its first amphibious operation in April 1944, landing on the island of New Britain, which had been captured by the Marines several months earlier. And they remained there until November 1944, when they were withdrawn to join what was going to be the largest amphibious assault of the entire war up to then. In January 1945, the 40th Infantry Division became part of a massive U.S. force that would land on the island of Luzon to begin the liberation of Manila. This force, with more than 900 warships and more than 200,000 soldiers of the U.S. Army, was a very heavily National Guard force. Of the 4 divisions that were to hit the beach, 3 were from the National Guard, including the 40th. Of the 5 divisions that followed, 3 were from the National Guard. This operation would be the first real combat for the 40th Infantry Division, and it opened with 3 days of shore bombardment by this massive fleet, firing upwards of 16,000 shells and with more than 800 air sorties against what were believed to be formidable Japanese shore defenses. Then, just after midnight on January 9th, they were woken up to prepare for the amphibious landing. Finally, 6 hours later, they boarded their landing craft and endured 3 hours of bobbing in the waves until the hour for the amphibious landing, called J hour, at 9 a.m. Then, this force hit the beach at 9:36 a.m., finding no opposition whatsoever. The Japanese, if they had been occupying the shore at all, have retreated inland, and all 4 divisions advanced on a broad front, fighting no more than small Japanese patrols sent to harass them. What they had found was that the Japanese had found an entirely new way to fight against American amphibious landings. The 40th Infantry Division, as it advanced inland, finally encountered Japanese defenses near Clark Field. These were exactly the kinds of defenses that the U.S. Marines would encounter a month later on Iwo Jima. They consisted of tunnels dug into the limestone hills, linking machine gun nests, anti-tank gun positions, and artillery emplacements. Assaulting these would be as difficult as the Marines would find later on Iwo Jima. And the position that the 40th Infantry Division encountered, furthermore, had 6-inch naval guns emplaced in them. These were capable of interdicting the route toward Manila, and this position had to be taken to neutralize this threat. Now, the assault on these positions began on January 24th, when the 160th Infantry advanced toward the ridges. They needed to use all of their combined arms to move forward. They needed to use M10 tank destroyers and M7 Priest 105mm self-propelled guns for direct fire to demolish the machine gun emplacements and artillery positions. Afterwards, infantrymen closed with demolition charges, grenades, and flamethrowers to finish off the Japanese. It was not until 5 days later that all these ridges finally fell. But beyond them, there were even more Japanese fortifications, and more than a month of fighting would be needed to eliminate the Japanese forces in this area. Now, similarly, diabolically prepared defenses were dug into hill after hill, which the 40th Infantry Division's regiments had to take one after the other. An indication of the severity of the fighting and the tenacity of the Japanese is that the first POW taken by the 160th was not captured until February 11th, a month after the landing on Luzon. This POW was taken by Lieutenant James Kim, who prepared the sketch of the Japanese defenses that you see on the left of the screen. The final battle in these hills for the 40th was for a hill called Hill 1700. This was a heavily fortified hill which could only be approached along 3 ridges that converged at the summit. All 3 of the 40th Infantry Division's regiments advanced along one of the ridges and converged on this hill. And the 185th Infantry Regiment finally raised the American flag on the summit on February 27th. After almost 2 months of fighting, the 40th Infantry Division was largely exhausted, and on March 2nd, they were finally relieved by another National Guard division. In mid-March, the 40th Infantry Division began an entirely different kind of war in the Philippines. Instead of moving forward against large Japanese formations on the large island of Luzon, it conducted island-hopping operations on the smaller islands, primarily in cooperation with large numbers of Philippine guerrillas. The first such operation was a landing on the island of Panay, where, within a few days, in cooperation with 20,000 Philippine guerrillas, the 40th Infantry's troops captured the capital, the airfield, and then a few days later, turned over the campaign to the Philippine guerrillas. Later, the largest of these operations occurred in late March on the island of Negros. Much as they had in the landing on Luzon, they moved forward, encountering no Japanese occupation until they found the Japanese main line of resistance on what was first called Hill 3155, and then was renamed Dolan Hill after the first American officer killed trying to take it. The 40th Infantry Division would spend 2 months fighting its way up this hill. Repeated attempts to advance up its slopes were thrown back by the Japanese defenders, who were occupying the kinds of defenses that the 40th had found on the island of Luzon. A final assault in mid-May succeeded only after 4 days of saturation artillery bombardment and airstrikes that completely destroyed all of the defenses and left more than 200 enemy dead on the hill. After finally clearing Japanese forces from Negros, the 40th Infantry turned over the campaign to a U.S. Airborne Regiment and Philippine guerrillas to prepare for its next campaign, which was to be the invasion of Japan. The plan for the invasion of Japan showed how far this National Guard unit had come in the past 4 years, because the 40th Infantry was to be the first to fight in the invasion. The invasion was supposed to occur in 2 parts. The first, called Operation Olympic, would be a landing on the southern island of Kyushu by 750,000 U.S. soldiers and Marines. The second, Operation Coronet, would be the final landing on the central island of Honshu by more than 1 million U.S. troops, with the battle for Tokyo expected by March 1st, 1946. They would be opposed by more than 4 million Japanese soldiers, with thousands of tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, kamikazes, suicide attack boats, and many other kinds of weapons that the Japanese were going to employ in the last defense of their homeland. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. casualties were expected in this campaign. The 40th would be the very first to fight. 4 hours before the opening of Operation Olympic, on November 1st, 1945, the 40th Infantry Division had the mission of attacking and securing 2 groups of islands along the sea lanes to the invasion beaches. I think that the best way to look at these operations would be to compare them to the operation at the Pointe du Hoc in Normandy. That was an operation involving a small number of U.S. Army Rangers to capture German positions overlooking the invasion beaches. This would be an operation on a massive scale, involving an entire 15,000-man Army Infantry Division. And it would open what would be expected to be a long, grueling campaign. Fortunately, this operation never came to pass. As everyone knows, the dropping of the atomic bombs in August 1945 and the announcement of the surrender of Japan on August 15th brought the war to an end and reprieved the 40th Infantry Division of having to conduct this mission. Instead, the 40th Infantry ended the war on the island of Panay, where it had been training for the invasion of Japan. And it accepted the surrender of Japanese forces on the island. The commander of the 160th Infantry, Colonel Raymond Stanton, accepted the Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945, at the very same time as the surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay. Ultimately, 1,750 Japanese soldiers came in from the hills in the days that followed. The men of the 160th Infantry Division, veterans of some of the most terrible fighting of the war in the preceding months, treated the captured Japanese humanely and prepared them to return to Japan to begin the reconstruction of their lives and their homeland. This, however, was not the end of the war for the 40th Infantry Division, because it had yet another mission ahead of it. Its final mission would be not in Japan, but in Korea, as part of the U.S. forces sent to liberate Korea and set up the U.S. occupation zone in the southern half, below the 38th parallel. For this mission, the 40th Infantry Division's regiments reorganized from the regimental combat teams that they had been for the past several years into regimental military government teams in preparation for administering large parts of the countryside in Korea. From early September to early October, convoys of transports departed Panay, bound for the port of Incheon. And the advance party landed in Incheon on September 15th. As the U.S. forces had already landed in Korea, concentrated in Seoul and along the 38th parallel boundary with the Soviet occupation zone. The 40th Infantry Division landed at Incheon and then advanced into southern Korea, finally arriving at the port city of Busan on October 2nd. There, the 160th Infantry accomplished a historic task. It oversaw the repatriation of almost 1 million Japanese soldiers and civilians from Korea and Korean civilians from Japan in an exchange of populations that ended the Japanese colonial presence in Korea and returned many Koreans to their homeland from forced labor in Japan. This mission was accomplished peacefully and humanely, with no violent incidents between either Americans and Japanese or between Koreans and Japanese, creating the conditions for eventual post-war reconciliation between the two countries. After this final mission, the 40th Infantry Division gradually demobilized in place. The first 1,000 men had already left Panay to return to the United States, even before the division shipped out to Korea. And about 1,000 men returned to the U.S. each month. By mid-January 1946, fewer than 7,000 men remained, less than half of what the division had started with, and almost none of them the veterans who had fought during the war. Its return to the U.S. was completed in 1946, followed by its disbanding. And the 40th Infantry Division, in the Second World War, receded into history. Now, this is the story of one National Guard unit that is remembered by few outside of the Army National Guard itself, but accomplished remarkable things in the Pacific theater during the Second World War. It was the first to fight and defeat the Japanese defensive tactics that would prove so costly to U.S. forces on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and other islands on the way to Japan in 1945. They liberated multiple Philippine islands from Japanese occupation. They were to be the first to fight in the invasion of Japan. And ultimately, they liberated this half of South Korea and supervised the peaceful and humane repatriation of almost 1 million people between Japan and Korea. These were accomplishments that can stand up with those of any division that fought in the Pacific theater or the European theater. And they should be remembered. And furthermore, it is part of the heritage of National Guard units that still exists to this day. The 40th Infantry Division is still the premier combat formation of the California National Guard, and each of its infantry regiments, those that fought from both California and New York, are still parts of the National Guards of California, New York. Other units in Utah and Nevada still exist. These are historical memories to pass forward and to remember as the challenges of the future in the Asia Pacific region emerge in the future.
Thank you, Robert, for sharing this story with us. I know I picked up a few new bits of information, and I'm sure our at-home audience did as well. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that I took note of while you were doing your presentation. So the first one is, can you tell me a little bit about how this story relates to your book?
I'd be happy to, Lauren. The story of the 40th Infantry Division is a key part of the family history that is presented in my book, Victory in Shanghai. It tells the story of James Kim and his 3 brothers, all of whom fought for the United States in the Second World War. 3 of them as non-U.S. citizens who were civilians in Japanese-occupied China, and one of whom, James, was born a U.S. citizen, had volunteered for the U.S. Army before Pearl Harbor, and ended up serving as an officer in the 40th Infantry Division for the duration of the Second World War. And it is a small but very significant part of the family history that I presented in my book.
Okay, so next question I have for you is, how many states were represented in the National Guard in the Pacific Theater?
Well, I think it would be easier to list the states that weren't involved than to describe how many. Almost the vast majority of the 48 states of the Union were represented in the National Guard units that were sent to the Pacific. Of the 10 divisions, there were 26 states represented from both coasts and almost all the states in between. In addition, there were numerous independent regiments, battalions of various kinds sent. So it's fair to say that practically every state was represented. So the National Guards of almost every state in the U.S. Have a story in the Pacific War, which may or may not have been passed down over the years. And I think it would be great if more attention were focused on it. There is one unit, the 32nd Infantry Division from Michigan and Wisconsin, which actually was the subject of a recent book. But most of the rest of the Guard in the Pacific, I think, has gotten very little attention. And I'd be happy to see more attention sent their way.
And my next question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about your inspiration for diving into this story? Do you have a personal tie?
Well, I very much do have a personal tie to this story. I'm, at this point, very close friends with the unrelated Kim family, who were the subject of my book. And I have been actually working with the family of James Kim to donate some of their father's artifacts to museums. He had a, I think, quite noteworthy set of experiences with the 40th Infantry during the Second World War. And I would like to see that memorialized in military museums around the nation. And this is an ongoing effort that will probably go well into next year.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you, Robert, for spending some time with us today and sharing this story. And I also want to give a shout out to our at-home audience. Thank you for spending a bit of your day with us as well. In preparation for this webcast, we looked into our own museum collections to see if we had any artifacts related to the 40th Infantry Division of the National Guard. And we do. We have a scrapbook regarding the service of Bert J. Collier Jr. entitled 40th Division Overseas, which has 300 black and white photos detailing the experiences of the division. We invite you to Fredericksburg, Texas to come see our newly renovated galleries where you can immerse yourself in similar stories of the Pacific War. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.